I'm good to go? Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Hello. Great, thank you. Okay, hi everybody, and welcome to this very special panel. I'm Marcine Mitchell. I am the Senior Vice President of Climate Change for the World Wildlife Fund, and we welcome you all today. We have a very special panel. As you know, America is All In represents a movement of bottom-up climate action. It's people from all over the country, from different kinds of institutions, from government entities, and from all levels banding together and bringing the best to meet our climate goals. And so today we are really proud to present representatives from all levels of government in the U.S. We have Libby Schaaf, who is the mayor of the city of Oakland in the great state of California. We have Governor Jay Inslee from the great state of Washington. And we have a special guest, Brenda Mallory, who last year was confirmed by the Senate as the 12th chair of the Council on Environmental Quality, CEQ. And so we're really happy to have you all welcome. And without further ado, let's start with things off with Chair Mallory, who will talk a little bit about the Biden administration's climate agenda. There's a mic right there for you.
Hello. All right. Thank you so much. It is such a pleasure to be here and to have the opportunity in particular to talk to this group, because one of the things that we know is absolutely critical in order to meet our climate goals and to get our climate agenda implemented is that we're working at all levels, that we are partnering with the states and the local governments, that when the federal government has, lost its focus, it's been the states and local governments that have helped us keep going. And so we're just grateful for that and recognize the importance and the value of the partnership with all of you in the room and those of you represent going more broadly. So I'm going to touch on a few things that I think are related to where the president is and where we are therefore all at this moment as we're trying to implement the agenda, and then I think turn it over to my co-panelists. Governor Inslee and I were actually just talking before we walked in here about the opportunities that we have right now because we are connecting across the board with so many important players in the field, and so I'm just grateful for his partnership. We had a chance actually to meet last year in his home state, where even in the few minutes that I was able to be in his office, heard a lot about the great work going on there, and so I'm just grateful for everything that you're doing. So back to the main point that I made at the top, which is that because this is the kind of crisis that really not only requires an all participation from all sectors, it's an all of government approach. The president from the very beginning has grounded the agenda and the way that we approach issues in the notion that every agency has a role, every agency has something to contribute to this effort, and very much pushing that notion. And under the first ever climate task force that was created when the president came into office, that has been like an organizing mechanism for us to try to make sure that we're all kind of moving in the right direction and that we're implementing the kind of ambition that's essential for the crisis that we're facing. But to me, it's just one example of, I think, a message that you hear from the president all the time, which is when you're dealing with the kind of existential crisis that we are facing, like there's no one answer, there's no one solution. This is the kind of thing where we have to really all be bringing together the gifts that we have, the strengths that we have, the networks that we have, the connections that we have, in order to deploy them in a way that is going to really help us with our lessons. And in fact, we were just talking, Marcy and I, just before this meeting about, thinking about how you deploy your own connections and your networks in ways that help to advance the goal is very much a part of, I think, where we are right now. One of the areas, obviously, where a lot of attention is focused, particularly with the connection with state and local communities, is with the extreme weather events that we are facing just repeatedly, and every part of this country has had some storm or extreme event that is unusual for anything that they have experienced before, in where that partnership with the federal government is so important in helping to figure out how to manage it. Just last year, 40% of the counties had a disaster declaration, and there were more than 20 extreme weather events or climate events that cost over $1 billion. With the grand total costing over $100 billion. And so for those of you who live in those communities, who've experienced them, you don't need me to give you that quote, right? Because you know what that was like. And we also know that when we have these events, that it disproportionately affects the low-income, poor communities of color, and the fact that they occur with repetition is part of the crisis. And so we talk about the dollars and we talk about the specific events that are happening usually just at the moment, but for the person whose house has been hit 2 or 3 times over a 2-year period, or who lives in fear of what's going to happen next, I mean, this is a much more significant a matter than what the dollars tell. And I was in Mississippi a few months ago, talking to a community there, which has sort of faced some of these repeat storms. And one of the stories, one of the things that I heard there that really affected me was just how it was the older people in the community who were really being experienced this to a much greater extent, and how, people who had lived in a certain community for, 60, 70 years, like they just no longer could do it because they couldn't afford the repeat damage. Their houses don't have the value that it should have or would have had but for these storms. And like now, here they are, 70, 80, 90 years old, and they live in fear of a rainstorm that starts and they don't know when it's going to end. So like all of these like really give a feel for like the human connection that I think really is impactful. But this is a place in which I think, because there's such focus, the Inflation Reduction Act and bipartisan infrastructure law both have given us new tools and a lot of funding that is going in the direction of resilience and trying to kind of prepare ourselves to deal with the sort of impacts that we're dealing with. The bipartisan infrastructure law, which passed last year, is delivering $50 billion to help communities bolster their protection from extreme weather. In the largest resilience investment in history, and its impact will be felt really in every community. There's also a new $8.7 billion program that will help create and improve evacuation routes, strengthen coastal resilience, and fund some of the upgrades that are necessary, because we've waited so long in dealing with this issue. We have to be fighting and getting ourselves prepared for the decarbonization, but we have to deal with the day-to-day impacts that people are experiencing in their communities because we're too late. Another program that I'll mention is that the Forest Service is deploying $2.5 billion to reduce wildfire risks to communities by thinning overgrowth and restoring forest health. And I just want to say, I'm thinking about the Forest Service because, one of the things that's absolutely critical from the work as we're doing implementation is the importance of recognizing that we've got to balance how we do these things, right? If we're not careful, we can cause more harm in fixing the harm that we're trying to address than we intend. So there really is calling on a level of sophistication about the degree, the approach that we're taking in the way that we implement all of our efforts to kind of address climate and other things as well. Let's see, so I feel like I'm going on, so I'm going to wrap up and say just thank you to this group again. I think if you're watching at all the work that we're doing, and hopefully in your own communities you're feeling the work that we're doing based on the great investments that we've gotten both from the IRA and bill, as well as other efforts to really trying to shore up our infrastructure and other means of fighting climate, that you are feeling that. We are trying to make sure that these are not things that you're just reading about in the paper, but that we're experiencing them on the state and local levels. And so thank you for the partnerships that I am sure that we are all engaging in or have been, and what will come. And with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Chair Mallory, and to CEQ. We've all been really impressed about the important strategic announcements that were made from the White House this week. And, you know, it's really a great step forward. So, but turning now to the state level and the state perspective, Chair Mallory talked about the Inflation Reduction Act. And we know that a lot of that needs to be implemented at the state and local levels. And so much success, because this is incentive, so much success will be how do we implement this. So, Governor Inslee, can you tell us about how the impact of the Inflation Reduction Act will come in terms of your state of Washington, and how you are going to respond to that and make sure that the good work gets done on the ground?
Well, my perspective is that we ought to give President Joe Biden a round of applause for the work that he's done. He pulled a rabbit. The CEQ, obviously, listened to your advice. Listen, he pulled a rabbit out of his hat. There was an incredible political achievement that now gives us two arms in the fight against climate change. One arm is the federal government, the other arm are the states and local communities and cities. And now we have two arms, or three, engaged in this effort. And I can't tell you how welcome that is, because we've been fighting it in my state for some period of time. But to now to have this multi-billion-dollar infusion available to us, this is absolutely earth-shaking to now to be able to come to the COP, this is my fifth COP, to be able to come to the world and say the United States is back in the game. That's a great news for the whole world and for our nation. I could not be more tickled pink. We understand, though, to make effective use of those billions of dollars, you've got to have states and cities to actually bring it home. It's like an airplane in the sky, but if you don't have a landing pad, it's not going to get implemented. So the states and the cities are absolutely crucial to this in multiple ways. One of which is the permitting that's going to be necessary to build these climate infrastructure projects to get this done. It all involves states and cities and counties in the permitting process. That's why we have to accelerate our state and local permitting processes in multiple ways, including by building the permitting infrastructure. And I bring this up because this is a neat, sexy topic that is ever discussed in a climate forum. And that is the need to have the number of staff in our regulatory agencies to actually run these permits, so we can permit solar, concentrated solar, so we can permit wind, so we can permit manufacturing, high-capacity battery. We have all the money in the world from the federal government. It can't get spent unless it can get permitted. So it's something we really emphasize in local communities. Then we've got to make sure to help the federal government target these dollars where they're going to do the most good. And I think this is an important discussion, because there's always a tendency, frankly, in the federal government, in the U.S. Congress, to spread any federal dollar like butter. So you have an inch-thick layer of butter all across the United States, where every state gets treated, quote, equally. Well, equally isn't necessarily the way to spend this money. If you can spend $1 in my state and get 2 tons of carbon reduction instead of another state where you get 1 ton, you should spend it in my state, and vice versa. So we're going to be working with the federal government to help channel their investment where it actually gets results. That's the first thing I say. Second thing I say is, look, our state action is of equal scale, or potential state action is of equal scale and of equal importance as federal action, using our state dollars, using our state regulatory system. So my cap and invest bill, which is the best in the country, and I'm going to say good things about California in a minute, but in our best cap and invest system, we are creating an investment that matches the federal Inflation Reduction Act on a per capita basis. So the scale of what we can do in the investment in our states as everybody's lives should be as the federal government. In a regulatory standpoint, frankly, is more aggressive than the federal government. In our cap and invest bill, in the nation's first statewide regulatory system that will essentially phase out fossil fuel gas in our residential and commercial structures, because we just passed, because of Lisa's leadership in the building code, a provision that will put heat pump starting in 2023 in every single house, in every single commercial building in the state of Washington is going to have a heat pump, which dramatically reduces the necessity of having fossil fuels. So all of this regulatory structure, we're going faster and farther than the federal government can. No matter how great the federal government was in the Inflation Reduction Act, we're doing one of our states, and that's great. So I'm excited right now. Shout out to Oakland, because I know you've done great things. So did your predecessor, Mayor Joe Brown. In Joe's work as a governor, he helped us start the U.S. Climate Alliance, which now has 23 states that are moving the needle. And that started with Joe Brown's leadership in so many different ways. So thank you for Oakland for the great work you're doing too.
Great. Well, that is a perfect segue to talk to Mayor Schaaf about the local perspective and what kind of opportunities is this opening up at the local, and challenges, and particularly on the equity side for the local governments. And also, what would you say to the states? You've got not your state governor, but just in general, and the governors. How can the state support the local? Because this comes down from federal to state to local.
Well, I've got to say that Washington and California have tremendous support from the states. So I want to give my love to the mayors, like my friend Steve Adler, the mayor of Austin, Texas, that does not have a friendly governor in the State House. So I cannot complain about my governor and our state. And I just have to say, this president is like the polar opposite from the last president, who literally hated everything that my city stands for: social justice, equity, inclusion, diversity. I felt like I had an enemy combatant in the White House. He literally actually tried to put me in jail, but that's a story for another day. With Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, she's an Oaklander, in the White House, we have values-aligned leadership that is not only looking to do climate change, but to do it the right way. And I don't want to just talk about the IRA. I also want to talk about something that is celebrating its one-year anniversary today, and that is the bipartisan infrastructure law, because that is also a tremendous opportunity. But I want to, because I'm a mayor, we have to ground things in people and communities. So I want to describe for you one community in my city, and I want to call it Miss Margaret's West Oakland. Miss Margaret is an incredible climate advocate in West Oakland. West Oakland is surrounded by freeways. It's right next to the toll plaza of the Bay Bridge that connects Oakland and San Francisco. It is where the port of Oakland is and operates both the ships, the trucks, the trains. All of that is in Miss Margaret's backyard. Miss Margaret has suffered her whole life from asthma, as have her children and her grandchildren. What I see for Miss Margaret's West Oakland is a complete transformation thanks to the BIL and the IRA. And I want to lift up, we're supposed to lift up our local accomplishments. Oakland has completely banned natural gas in all new construction. So Miss Margaret knows that new buildings that are going up in her neighborhood will not have natural gas in them, but that doesn't solve the problem in Miss Margaret's home. And do you all know that a gas stove is one of the worst contributors to poor health, air quality outcomes inside your home? So if you have asthma, it turns out your stove is one of your biggest enemies. And so we see tremendous opportunities for the IRA to provide funding to take our older buildings, our existing buildings, particularly in overly impacted communities like Miss Margaret's West Oakland, and allow them to convert to electric, to heat pumps, to electric and induction stoves, to not only reduce our emissions, but to have much better health outcomes from inside our homes. We also see an opportunity. We have a small mega grant under the BIL to actually take what was a shipping terminal that is no longer needed and is too small for modern day shipping, and to give it back over to the people and to turn it into a new neighborhood. It is actually in one of the most transit-rich parts of our city, with a ferry terminal, an Amtrak station, 2 BART stations that, if we can make the connections more walkable and bikeable, are very accessible. And to create a new neighborhood on Oakland's waterfront with public parks that are good for our health, with good union jobs, which is another priority of this administration, with affordable housing, and jobs and homes that are transit accessible so people don't have to even own a car to live their daily lives. That is our opportunity, and that is a funding program that this administration has created that did not exist before. This new development would be net, carbon neutral. It requires mitigation to be local. The private development will clean up centuries of soil contamination. And because of our building codes, it will have to be built to 100-year sea level rise standards. And of course, no natural gas. And the people who live there, which will be neighbors of Miss Margaret, because it's right next to West Oakland, will also be healthier because of another grant that your federal government just gave to our Port of Oakland to further electrify the port equipment, to create battery storage so that our port can accelerate towards its goal of being a zero emissions seaport, while it still delivers goods to and from all of your economies. The Port of Oakland literally touches every single state in the whole country. But now it can do it in a way that does not send Miss Margaret's grandchildren to the hospital. And then finally, this federal government is doing something that I could only have dreamed of when I became the mayor of Oakland. When I became the mayor of Oakland, this freeway that runs on one side of Miss Margaret's neighborhood, the 980, it was built to connect to a bridge that never got built. It is a behemoth 8-lane structure that I call it the racist moat. It is literally a sunken freeway that separates the traditional black working class neighborhood of West Oakland from our downtown. It is literally a gash in the face of our city, and it clearly separates these communities. The federal government has actually created a funding program to eliminate these types of community separating, racist, I'm sorry, let's just call it what it is, inequitable pieces of infrastructure that we now can see clearly have had really unjust results. So I am so excited. I literally didn't think I would live to see the day when we took down the 980 freeway, replaced it with a boulevard that can support local jobs, parks, affordable housing. But that is actually going to become a reality within my soon lifetime, thanks to this administration and your leadership. On behalf of Miss Margaret and myself, I thank you profoundly.
Well, thank you, Mayor. That was a very inspirational story to see that vision of what could be when we put our money in those type of ways that connect us instead of separate us. I want to turn to the fact of, we were talking about it, the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Act, et cetera. President Biden said in his speech that we could get to the 50% NDC that the U.S. has put up there. And we know that these acts, they're estimated, will get us to 42%. So we have a gap to fill. So my question is, and to Governor Inslee and Chair Mallory, feel free to chime in as well, is how do we close that gap? I know that you had looked at doing a price on carbon, and these acts tend to be incentives, so they're carrots versus a price is more of a regulation, more of a you have to do it. So do you think we need both of those, the price, in order to fill that gap, or do you think we can get all the way there with just this kind of incentives?
Yeah, well, it is absolutely clear that we need more than the Inflation Reduction Act to get this job done. It is absolutely clear. Now, in the near term, the next great shoulders that are going to have to carry us forward are the states and the cities. The federal government's kind of tapped out in the next year what it's going to do in the next 2 years. So that means we got to carry the ball. But the good news is we are carrying the ball, big time. So in my state and in California, we have a very firm regulation. We're not going to sell internal combustion vehicles after 2035. We're just not going to do it. And that's the law, and it's going to be the law, and it's going to stay the law. In my state, we have a firm enforceable commitment that 100% of the grid will be non-fossil fuels, and that's the law, and it's going to stay the law. We have a law that our low-carbon fuel standard will require the fossil fuel industry to clean up some of their fuels and give consumers cleaner, effective laws. Our price on carbon, we do have a price on carbon. The first auction will take place this February, and it will create at least $6 billion just for our transportation sector to go to clean transportation. And when we distribute those dollars, this is very important law, we will make sure that 40% of those expenditures go to disadvantaged and disproportionately impacted communities. An additional 10% will go to tribal communities. That is a firm commitment to bring environmental justice to this investment. California has a somewhat similar proposal. We've learned from California. We've been a little more aggressive in this regard in California. But these are written in law, and we have to move forward in this regard. But we can't stop at that. In our building codes, in our zoning plans, we have to start to build cities that are climate friendly, that reduce energy consumption. And our zoning is extremely important in this. We have to start focusing on building more housing. Both California and Washington have a homelessness crisis, and we need to start building housing in transit corridors where we have low and zero public transit available to people. So we, both in California and Washington, are fighting to change our zoning laws so that we can build these high-density capacity systems next to transportation corridors. And frankly, this isn't that easy politically. We have a disease, we have a virus called NIMBYism that still is present in my state. I intend to beat the NIMBYs in the next legislative session so we can start to build housing in our downtown areas for people, so we don't use so much carbon-intensive transportation to get this job done. So yes, we need to do much more. We're doing it, and I'm happy to see we're moving the ball in our state.
Great. So, Chair Mallory, would you like to weigh in
Can
on
I
that
just
gap?
add two things, because two thoughts immediately come to mind. One is the importance of the technology advancements, because we've seen over the decades when we do regulations, they often end up having a better impact than we thought, because when you put the technology in places, and I think that we can expect that to happen as well. And then the second thing is, again, thinking about this group and the private sector interconnection with state and local governments. Like, I think that's a really important and powerful connection, because we have estimates about some investment, but again, when you see a good thing, it often encourages other investment. And so I think the expectation that we will have, if we create the kind of cohesive partnerships across state, local, federal lines with our private sector communities, I think we will have impacts that are greater than even those that we're estimating, to be conservative.
Great, thank you. And Mayor Schaaf, one of the things came that was very, encouraging out of this new legislation was this idea of putting 40% towards disadvantaged communities and really having a climate justice bent. You come from a very diverse community, and sometimes this is easier said than done. There's one thing to bring people to the table, and there's another thing, given the historic, experiences of these communities, to have them feel like that they can really engage, that they're really heard, that they really can participate, and that those benefits will flow their way. So maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the things that we can do to, really make that implementation of that Climate 40 more than a vision, but really work at the local level and bringing in those communities.
Well, I'll lift up two examples of things. One that I want to celebrate the state of California for doing. By law, our legislature passed a law requiring impacted communities to actually develop their own air quality plans. So in other words, the people who have felt the impacts of not just emissions as a climate issue, but as a direct health issue, actually are creating these plans. And I lifted up Miss Margaret. She played a tremendous leadership role in California's first community plan out of West Oakland. So please give it up for Miss Margaret Gordon. She's a treasure. And what's interesting is sometimes the community asks for things that you hadn't thought about, that government hadn't thought about. This neighborhood, again, it's right up against our port. We've added some distribution centers, and this community had the idea for one of these industrial users to put solar on their roofs, but for that energy to actually power the residential neighborhood within 3 miles of the industrial use. So community-owned solar, neighborhood-based, making a huge difference, an idea that came right out of the community. But the second thing I want to lift up is sometimes we in government need to change how we engage our residents. We tend to do it through commissions, task forces. It's still kind of a hierarchical structure. And so in Oakland, we've been trying to kind of get out of our comfort zone. During COVID, we put out a bunch of slow streets. Do you all know what a slow street is, where you close the street to through traffic and encourage people to walk, bike, scooter, roller skate? Well, we put on the slow street signage, please text this number and complete a short survey about what you think of this slow street. And we saw a huge difference depending on which neighborhood that slow street was in. And in our lower income communities of color, we heard right away, like, this is not something that is helping us. What we need is safer intersections and crosswalks to cross dangerous streets to get to our neighborhood grocery store, the COVID testing center, the laundromat that I continue to rely on even though we're in this pandemic. And so we literally took out the slow streets in those neighborhoods and figured out a way to use those temporary barriers to slow down traffic in these key intersections. An idea we would never have come up with if we did not hear it directly from the people using a new form of communications, which was a simple text survey. We also used door hangers. We literally targeted neighborhoods that had not participated in submitting capital improvement requests, something that we invite our public to do. We went out, hung door hangers, and for the first time, when you look at a map of where the ideas came from, it literally lays over our entire city with extra concentration in our low-income communities of color, and for the first time, we funded multiple proposals that were submitted in a language other than English. That is when you know people feel like they really have been invited to be co-creators of the public good. So those are some ideas right on the ground in Oakland, California, of how we can really advance the equity agenda.
Great examples, and thank you so much. We just have a couple minutes left, and I wanted to invite the audience, if they have any questions, to be able to ask that of our panel. So can we get a microphone? Here in the back.
Hi, my name is Bennett. I am a college student, and I have a question specifically about state action, so I suppose it goes to Governor Inslee, but really anyone could answer. So the United States in the past several years has, I would say, demonstrated a pretty clear commitment to mitigation through acts like the bill and the IRA, as well as several smaller scale pieces of legislation. But the U.S. has received a lot of criticism at various COPs and in the last, really from around the world, for failing to address kind of finance with adaptation, as well as with loss and damage. And I was curious, since there doesn't seem to be a coordinated federal response to that, or motivation at a federal level to finance that, are there options that states can use to help with those crises? Thank you.
Well, before I get to states, let me just tell you, even without a COP agreement, one of the things our nation needs to do is reform the World Bank so that it becomes a positive influence on the economic development futures of these countries. And I think it's imperative we do so. That institution, whose current leadership has not demonstrated a commitment to really deal with climate change or the equity needs of these countries. I just point that out. That's something the federal government needs to do. On the state level, we are focusing on equity within our borders at the moment, and that we are committed to. You've heard of our 40% requirement for investment in our disadvantaged communities, including for their adaptation, and 10% for tribal communities. But then we're not stopping there. We're also requiring consultation with our tribal communities when we do any of these investments in clean energy. So I would focus on what we're doing right now from an equity standpoint within our borders at the moment. We're going to be interested to see what comes out of this COP. I think those discussions are going on right now. I would suggest one of the ways we could look at this issue of helping other countries is not necessarily just from a moral perspective, but from this standpoint, which is that if you can make a contribution to another developing nation and generate 100 tons saving for $1, and that same investment only does 50 tons for the same dollar, it's a good investment to make. And if we look at it from that standpoint, it can make sense. But in short answer to the question, we have not, in my state at least, had any immediate serious consideration of foreign distribution of state general fund. But I am proud that we are, I think, acting in the most equitable and most sensitive commitment to these disadvantaged communities within our borders of any state in the United States. And I'm proud of that.
I want to add, in California, I'm involved with an effort to make it easier for local communities to pass bonds, public bonds are an incredibly powerful financing source. And right now, and I don't know the laws in every state, but in California, they require a 2/3 vote. So we are actually going to try and get that lowered to a simple majority, as well as expand the allowable uses of bond proceeds so that they can better address homelessness. But these bonds could also finance the conversion to electricity for existing homes. So local bonds, very powerful financing tool, and the fact that they are voter approved creates a sense of buy-in, a sense of empowerment, a sense of accountability with your local jurisdiction that I think is powerful beyond just the money.
Hello, thank you. I'm from Southeast Louisiana in a little town called Dulac. I was hit directly by Ida. Ida came straight over my house. And I hear you speak on how the IRA has helped your community. The IRA has again made my community a sacrifice zone by giving oil and gas in my state more power than ever to build out in Black, Indigenous, and impoverished communities. How can you help communities like mine to not be those sacrifice zones anymore? And how can we use the IRA to implement a just transition to renewables?
Who would like to answer that? It's open to all. One of the.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for that question. I think that is one that I can honestly say that we are very well focused on as an issue. I think one of the ways in which we think about broadly the IRA as first of all, a statute that we got through compromise, and just a recognition of that. And our thought on it is really that it becomes incumbent on us in the implementation to be spending extra effort in trying to ensure that the implementation of it is done in ways that minimize impacts, focused on communities, focused broadly on the overall impact, not just on from a climate perspective, more broadly on what the impacts are going to be on the ground. And so I think that we see that as being part of the challenge that we have in ensuring that it works in a way overall and not create the sacrifice zone that you're referring to.
Can I just add that I think there's an opportunity the next time you have a funding program to not do the traditional cities are competing against cities, because some areas are not going to have the capacity, either because they've just gone through, a crisis and emergency, or they're small and they just don't have the staff capacity. I mean, I always was shocked when I got into local government that cities actually pay for lobbyists to lobby the federal government. And so to try and start changing some of our structures on how this money goes out. And I recognize there's a lot of pressure to get it out on the street quickly to show results, but I love the proverb that if we want to go fast, go alone, and if we want to go far, let's go together. So I hope that the next time there's a funding opportunity, we might rethink that traditional competitive model.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, one of the things Marcina and I was talking about even before this started was that people hear that we have a certain amount of money to do any such thing, and don't always know the rules that are attached to each of those dollars. And there are rules attached to those dollars. And so that is something that we're very aware of, and I think a challenge that I think is part of the implementation that we're taking on. And I would say specifically on your point about the fact that some communities are better situated than others in order to compete, compete for dollars in a number of different ways. That is also something that we are laser focused on and paying attention to. And when we talk to our partners in philanthropy, for example, one of the issues that at least I'm commonly raising, and I know I'm not the only one, is that we got more technical assistance dollars in the bill and IRA funding than we probably have gotten previously. And the reason that was there was because it was a recognition that you needed to actually help some people compete in ways that would make it possible. But even with that, there's still a need for certain communities, and particularly communities who that don't have the benefit of grant writers, don't have the benefit of full staffs, that there is a need to create infrastructure that provides the kind of support that will actually help them. And then another thing that I think is a factor, and again, this depends on what kind of, as I say, what color is the money, the idea that you can be talking about situations where you're thinking more broadly on a regional perspective. Like, I think that is a place where, as we think about how to develop our dollars, how to get the kind of funding mechanisms that we need, that we have to be also thinking about. Because some of our solutions, particularly for smaller communities, would be better served if we were able to use the dollars in that sort of a way.
Great. And so, Governor Inslee, do you want to have the final word for us, either on this point or a key takeaway that you'd like the audience to come away from this panel?
Yes, I want to thank everybody here on behalf of Trudy and myself. Wedding your grandchild 9 weeks ago. I've got another one due next week, and I'm going to report to their parents that all of you are doing something for my grandkids. So thank you for working to give them a habitable planet. I just want to mention the two ultimate renewable energy sources we have, which is perseverance and optimism. And if we use those two renewable energy sources, we're going to beat this demon of climate change. I'm convinced of it. I believe it is our destiny to do so, and let's go have lunch.
Great. Thank you so much. Let's get a really strong round of applause for all of our panelists for joining us for a great session. Thank you.
Can we get your quick group photo before you disperse?